recording here in a minute? Maybe it's already going.
Yep, you're all set.
Great, thanks so much. Well, hello and welcome to the September edition of Cell Society Seminar. My name's Hans Estrin, and I'm with the UVM Extension Produce team, and I help coordinate this series along with Andrew May and Chris Callahan. And today's topic is forestry. And I'm personally very excited to have these two great speakers with us, co-presenting under the title of Local Adaptive Forest Systems for Changing Global Conditions. And first up will be Tony D'Amato, Professor, Director of the Forestry Program and Director of UVM Research Forests. And then next we'll have Mike Snyder, who is now an independent forester and principal of Greenfire Enterprises Consulting, and most well known as the former commissioner of the Vermont Forest Parks and Recreation. And it was, I guess, 12 years running, and stepped down as of January 1 this year. So before I hand it over to them, just a little bit more about Cell Society seminars, our overall goals.
Share your screen, Hans?
Excuse me?
Do you want to share your screen? Are you intending to have a screen share happening right now?
Oh, maybe. Thank you. I guess I'll do that. Sorry about that. Not a bad idea. Okay, thanks for your patience here. Okay, so overall goals of this seminar are really to promote connections, transfer of knowledge, transdisciplinary collaboration, and then maybe get into some effective leverage of research findings and idea of new research projects, and overall really to have a collective impact that is emergent and is bigger than the sum of its parts. This seminar series is meant to be an opportunity to promote collaboration and ultimately weave a stronger network. Here's the team. Chris Callahan, I'd like to thank, and Andrew is sort of co-presenters. We're all volunteers, and the media team as well. Well, with Kathy Yando and the rest of them. And again, it's a collaborative effort, and your suggestions are more than welcome, actually encouraged. So if you want to learn more or check the schedule or make any suggestions, go to go.uvm.edu Cell Society some seminars. And you know, the way this works basically is we'll have monthly virtual seminars. If you've been here before, you know, and they, you know, including the one you're seeing today, and they're designed to be this opportunity to share within CALS and beyond. Typically, we have 2 speakers each, and theme 1, theme 2, 20 minutes each, and then 20-minute Q&A. And then quarterly out-of-the-box brainstorm sessions happen every 3 months after the 2 seminars, and we are, you know, currently looking for new emergent themes and trying to engage as many people as possible to come up with ideas that could leverage some grant proposals in time. Here we are, standing schedule every second Thursday at 2 p.m. and that occasionally changes, but you know, stay tuned for 3 more this year, and please, if you have any suggestions, especially for the out of the box coming up, feel free to share them with us. And finally, as we've mentioned, please visit Cell Society website, as seen here and at the link at the bottom for more information on upcoming seminars and also links to past recordings. So with that, I will turn it over to our presenters and stop my share. So pleased to turn it over to Tony first. You're up.
Thanks, Hans, and appreciate the opportunity to present today. Maybe as opposed to the theme 1, theme 2, really the goal I think for our presentations is a level 1 and a level 2 in terms of looking at just what's happening with forests and forestry in Vermont. And so my role really is to provide some perspective just from the UVM and more importantly, the research community around how we're looking at forests, what some of the threats are, and how we're addressing that via both our engagement and outreach as well as our research. And I feel really privileged to be able to include Mike as the co-presenter here for his section to really give us more of a true lived boots on the ground, as well as I like to say boots in the state house perspective on how these different issues are really percolating through the forests of Vermont and certainly through policy. And so the goal really is to build off of one another and just talk a little bit about what's been happening. So what I want to start with, just to kind of calibrate us, is particularly given this is in CALS and on the UVM campus, is just to remind everyone, despite the emphasis certainly of funding and other things around us, forests really are kind of outsized any other land use and land cover in Vermont, and really the Vermont brand and all that we derive from those forests is just a fabric of the life and the well-being that we have here in the state. And so when we think about Vermont and think about our working land, certainly a lot of the emphasis is on agriculture, but really many of us that work in forestry and work in forest ecology and forest conservation recognize just how spoiled we are as a state and as a region to have such a forested land base that really is really meant to be forested from a ecological perspective. And Mike will certainly talk a bit more about some of the challenges facing that, but really just to give those that aren't aware of it, even though we're quite forested, only 23% of that forest land is formally conserved and protected from development to other land use, something I'll talk about a bit more. So I felt for organizing this and talking a bit about what are some of the emerging challenges facing forests in Vermont and forestry and working lands in Vermont, that I'd kind of organize this a bit around just some of the driving threats. And again, something that Mike will speak to as well in terms of what's happening in the state. So the graph that you're looking at here was produced as part of a report that the Northern Forest Center generated this past year, where they interviewed forest stakeholders working in forest industry as well as working in forest conservation across Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and the Adirondack region of New York, and really had them discuss what they viewed as kind of the biggest threats to the future of the northern forest. And so the first part, invasive species, climate change should be no surprise. And in the context of forests, really, when we talk about invasive species, the principal ones we're most concerned about are invasive insects and diseases, things like emerald ash borer, beech leaf disease. But as you work your way down this list, you'll notice it really shifts pretty quickly into more socioeconomic dynamics, as well as just kind of broader social movements happening in the region, where the third thread is changing public perceptions of forestry. So as a land use, it's a very different perception from the public relative to agricultural land use, and kind of a growing negative public perception of there being working forest lands in the region. And then at the same time, despite people not liking forestry, they must not like forests even that much more, because we're seeing this continued development, conversion of forest to non-forest use or fragmentation of that land base. So what I'm going to do is kind of work in reverse order and talk a little bit about just some broad initiatives around trying to deal with forest fragmentation, as well as this public perception piece, and end by talking about some of the research and work that we're doing to try to adapt to these changes, particularly climate change and in the landscape. So most should already be well aware of this. Wasn't the best headlines for Vermont a few years ago when we basically discovered we were losing forest land for the first time in a century. And this was a regional trend, but certainly Vermont was part of that regional trend. So on the left, we have just some patterns of forest loss in the early 2000s. And this is a trend line that Ali Kasiba created from forest inventory analysis data when she was working for the state, actually someone that was hired by Mike. And you can see kind of this downward trend with forest land. In 2019, we actually increased in forest land. And so those feeling good about that, if I update this to the most recent numbers, we went down again in 2020, and we don't have the data yet for 2021, 2022, or 2023, but those of you that have spent time kind of traveling around Vermont are seeing it. We are losing a lot of forest land right now to development in response to second homes being developed, et cetera, as more and more people are moving into the state. And so clearly both a Vermont issue, but also a regional issue. And so some individuals at the University of Vermont, myself and Bill Keaton, as well as many others at the Harvard Forest and elsewhere for a couple of decades now, have been working on thinking of ways to effectively, stem the tide in terms of this loss of forest land and really try to sustain that working lands fabric throughout the region, both in terms of forests and both preserves as well as working woodlands, but also a kind of a more recent version of this includes the importance of farmlands and communities as part of that vision to the future. And so in a nutshell, really what this calls for is that, we know that forests are so important to our livelihood, to our well-being, and to really any facet of life in Vermont, just given how forested we are and all the benefits that derives. And so trying to really set forth a course of action that would conserve, over 70% of the region's forests and really allocate it into two primary types of land use. One being wildlands where no management occurs, so places where we can allow natural processes to develop over time, old forests to naturally develop, as well as have places where we can study and learn from in terms of the impacts of management elsewhere. And then couple that with working woodlands that are really important for sustaining local economies, but also providing opportunities for habitat management and ecological silviculture and adaptation and all those things that we've been doing for a long time now in kind of progressive forest management. And so I bring this up as a vision to kind of talk through that. There's been this template for a long time talking about the need to conserve forest land and protect land, but unfortunately, when we start looking at what's actually happening in the region, both in terms of just formal land protection as well as kind of general attitudes towards working woodlands, things certainly are not trending in a great direction. And so you can actually go online to the Wildlands and Woodlands. They have a dashboard where you can see kind of each state, kind of how close are they to these goals of achieving collectively in New England, 70% conserved forest. And in Vermont, it's actually a higher percentage of conserved forest, just given we have a lot more forest land relative to Connecticut and Massachusetts. And so what this dashboard is showing is kind of where Vermont currently sits. And so again, 23% of our forest land is formally conserved, so cannot be developed to any other land use. And the majority of that's public land. So we're very fortunate to have both state lands as well as federal lands that are keeping that land from being developed. But the majority of our land, again, is unconserved. And what we're seeing in terms of the pace that we're on right now is that if we really wanted to achieve this wildland and woodlands vision in terms of conserving forest land, we'd actually have to quadruple our pace of land conservation relative to today. And so what's a bit frustrating is when we talk about forestry in Vermont and forest management, much of the emphasis right now in kind of the public sector revolves around what's happening on public forest lands. Ironically, those lands can't be developed. And so we have this growing forest conservation deficit on private lands that's not getting enough attention, and certainly something that Mike will talk to that really needs to ramp up. At the same time, we really don't think a lot about where our wood comes from. We have a huge local food movement, a lot of emphasis on being a locavore, but there's really very little discussion about making sure that things are local when it comes to our wood, even though our region uses quite a bit of wood. And so in the early 2000s, there was a paper called The Illusion of Preservation that included an undergraduate from Harvard, Mary Burlick, as well as Dave Kittredge, who was an alum of the UVM Forestry Program in the late 70s, that really looked primarily at Massachusetts in this conundrum that it's a state that uses a ton of wood, but they also kind of protect a lot of land and really do not do a lot of active management. And so as a result, they export that wood demand elsewhere. And so we've been revisiting this illusion of preservation and really looking at all 6 New England states to understand kind of what's that balance between how much wood we use as consumers, all of us on this webinar and beyond, and then what's the amount of wood that's actually being harvested in a given state. And so if we look at New England as a whole, right now, New England is a net exporter of 28% of its wood demand elsewhere. And that could be Oregon, that could be, South Carolina, or it could be, South Africa, but it's not coming from New England and certainly kind of far outside of our region. If we look at Vermont as a state, we actually, based on the 2020 numbers, removed about 40% more than we consumed in terms of forest products. And that makes sense. We're a very rural forested state, and we also use a lot of wood for heating. And so as a result, we don't have a lot of consumption collectively, but we also, do use our wood to some degree for kind of for small scale use like that. But as a state, we're growing about 3 times as much as we're removing. And what's critical is when we look at this mass balance of consumption versus removal, really Maine is carrying the water for the whole region. So Maine is producing 316% more than they consume as a state. And by doing that, really getting quite close to almost, removing what they're growing. And so even within the region, we can see some of that inequity and balance as to like certain states are carrying much more of the burden in terms of wood production than others. And what's a bit, I think, challenging is that the state of Massachusetts, the state of Connecticut export 93 and 94% of their wood consumption elsewhere. And these are also the states that often have some of the most vocal, active movements against not cutting wood in the region in the name of carbon storage. And so we have this conundrum that's evolving where we're not really focusing in on local production, and we're also not reducing our consumption, and as a result, exporting those needs elsewhere. One last point on this is I keep bringing up the scrutiny that's being focused on public land right now, both in Vermont and really across the region. And so if I look at the amount of volume harvested by ownership in Vermont, the majority of that volume is coming off of private land. Only roughly 4% of the volume cut in 2020 actually came from public land, which is amazing given how much focus is on that. What I would argue, and those that are familiar with how public land management operates, whether it's the forest parks and recreation lands or the Green Mountain National Forest, there is a tremendous amount of review, a tremendous number of specialists, wildlife biologists, soil scientists, archaeologists that all provide comment and review of that wood being cut. And so when once wood is actually cut on public land, it's going and exceeding any standard for sustainability that any other wood from private land would ever have to meet. And so I would argue we should actually be increasing that wedge from public land as opposed to extinguishing it, which has certainly been some of the popular sentiment in the region. So how do we deal with this inequity? Well, the first is we do need to reduce consumption. We use a lot of wood, as a society, and so we should be finding ways to reduce how much wood we use. At the same time, we know, and those that have been following kind of the climate smart discussion around climate smart forestry, climate smart agriculture, when we look at actually, ways that we can decarbonize our construction and decarbonize our day-to-day life, wood products and substitution of wood for more fossil fuel intensive materials is often viewed as one of the best ways to deal with kind of meeting some of these mitigation goals in our built environment. And so the bottom is just showing you just the substitution benefit of using wood relative to more fossil fuel intensive materials. And it's pretty clear that building out of wood versus building out of steel and concrete really are key parts of thinking through how do we walk the talk in terms of climate smart. Ironically, those that live in Chittenden County or kind of just spend some time in this area, if you look at any new construction, this is a new building in Burlington I took a photo last year of, certainly along I-89, I would argue that there really is zero consideration being given to this right now. And I feel like at this point, we might want to start renaming Burlington the Steel City just by the mass amount of fossil fuel intensive building material we keep using. Likewise, if you look at the UVM Comprehensive Sustainability Plan, there is no mention in that plan about trying to substitute more carbon-intensive building materials with local carbon-friendly products like wood. And so I think we need to be kind of building that awareness, certainly here at UVM and beyond, as to this is a big part of being, conscious consumers into the future. So beyond the challenges that we're facing in terms of working woodlands as it relates to levels of harvest, where that occurs, and also losing forest land, the top of that list really includes things that are changing more broadly. So climate change, certainly this summer, we'd say, excessively wet summer and then some. Last summer was a drought. The year before that, we'd also say was a drought. And collectively, we're seeing just a broad shift in the climate patterns in the region. And so as a result, a lot of stress both on kind of our workforce, but also on the forests. So there's been a lot of projections what that means in terms of species possibly losing their suitability for habitat, as well as new species possibly moving in. And this map is just showing that based on just projections for climate, how many new species might be able to grow in Vermont in the future if they were able to migrate there. And at the same time, we already get a lot of new species that we're not psyched about. This is the density of non-native forests on the Northeast. And so we have all these changing dynamics that really create a lot of uncertainty as to how to actually move forward in a sustainable fashion and do it in a way that's sustaining all those goals that we care about from the land. So what we've been doing across Vermont in partnership with the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science and the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center is establishing large-scale experiments that actually are on the ground testing how do we adapt to these changes. And these are all co-produced with managers and ecologists and scientists and others at the table, really talking through these are kind of the broad changes that are occurring. How do I localize kind of adaptation to this place on the ground and develop these experiments that allow us to learn what are some potential ways going forward that we can still sustain habitat values and carbon values and wood products into the long run. And so this map is just giving you an idea of where those areas are, as well as the diverse partners that we're working with. And what's critical about these experiments is that they're large scale. So these are not just a 10-acre plot that we're managing. So that this map here is of a 400-acre area on Dartmouth College's second college grant, which is known as the Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change Experiment. And so in each of these 25-acre units, we're testing different strategies for adaptation, ranging from doing nothing, kind of observing that forest change on its own, to actually managing deliberately to transition that forest potentially to future adapted species. And across all of this, we're measuring many more things than just trees. Ecosystem management, kind of understanding ecosystem processes has been kind of the hallmark of what we do in modern forestry and modern forest science. And so understanding not just the impacts of these management regimes on tree growth and productivity, but also what does that mean in terms of bird species responses or mycorrhizal fungi or other attributes that we care a lot about. And the reason why we're excited to be able to do that is we want to be able to make decisions that don't just focus on a single objective. We know how to maximize carbon storage. The problem is there might be some trade-offs with other key objectives we value from forest ecosystems. And so as an example of that, what you're looking at here is a 200-acre portion of that experiment. Each one of these polygons is a different treatment. And this is a LiDAR canopy height model that we derive. So the lighter the color, actually, the taller the tree. So these areas here are actually gaps in the forest that are being planted with different tree species. And so what we find is that areas where we're not cutting or we're doing kind of a low level of cutting to try to kind of increase the vigor of the trees for resisting change tend to be the spots that have the highest levels of carbon storage. Right, there's more trees out there. It's kind of a common element. They also have the highest abundance of interior, wildlife species, but when we look at it from an adaptation standpoint, actually have the lowest profile functionally of being able to adapt to change. On the flip side, when we look at those treatments that are kind of managing more actively for resilience or managing or actually transitioning aspects of that ecosystem to the future, those of course have lower levels of carbon storage because we're creating gaps where things are regenerating, but they also are creating habitat for species that aren't found elsewhere. So chestnut-sided warblers or hooded warblers that weren't found in that landscape prior to doing these treatments. And this is also kind of instilling that adaptation potential. And so as we think about the future of Vermont's forest, we need to think through how do we make sure we have a mosaic of conditions that really can sustain all these values going forward, not just a single kind of monolithic value that maximizes carbon or maximizes some other approach. So the final thing I'll say before giving it over to Mike is that besides looking at kind of the changing environment, it's really critical also to understand like how managers are actually responding on the ground to these changes. So we were fortunate to work with Rachel Chapman, and we still work with Rachel Chapman. She was at UVM and is now at UMaine, and we can occasionally entice her to work with incredibly long-lived perennial plants known as trees. And so we did some work where we interviewed foresters across the region and really asked them what are the main challenges they're facing. So this graph here shows kind of the different things they indicated as challenges. That the height of the bar indicates kind of how important that was. So the taller the height, the more commonly that was mentioned. And then these pathways going from them, that's just kind of a number of people that then said how they were addressing that challenge. So invasive species, many people said they are dealing with invasive species by invasive plant management. So if we look at the challenges they're recognizing, certainly not a surprise in terms of the lists. And of course, I'm happy that the main adaptation they're taking is silvicultural prescriptions. But what I think is more important is like, what are they viewing right now as barriers to adapting to change? And the majority of what they're identifying is not enough science from UVM. It's really other things far external to that. So economics, kind of lack of markets, lack of the ability to do these things. Importantly, kind of increasing public scrutiny and actually the public not wanting forest management to occur, as well as lack of labor in markets, which I know are certainly brought up in other sectors. And so it's not just about what trees do I plant out there, but it's how do we actually get the public to understand that working lands are critical for not just the economy, but also for the ability to adapt and provide these different values. So I'll conclude and give it to Mike to dig in more on this, but I think we all know if it comes to climate change and the future of Vermont, forests are going to carry the weight. Before or other things, we have some challenges that are facing us. And it's not just about having kind of that diversity of ecological conditions. A lot of things that I'm excited about have markets and policies and really willingness to pay for and encourage local wood so that we can sustain these communities that actually are the ones pulling off on those adaptation actions on the ground. And so as I mentioned, kind of the chance now is to flip to Mike and really get into like, what does this look like when we start pushing the rope in the legislature and elsewhere, and kind of how do we deal with the challenges we're facing right now in Vermont from a more logistical on the ground and policy perspective. Stop sharing.
Thanks so much, Tony. And I just want to say to everyone, please dump questions in the chat. We will address them all at the end as we're going. And also keeping your video off might help with all the bandwidth stuff, just to ensure better flow, if possible. Except you, Mike, and you're on.
Okay, shall I jump in there, Hans? Okay. I'm seeing big changes on the screen. Assuming all is good to go. Thank you, Tony. Thanks, Hans. Thank you all. I'm truly delighted to join you today. I'm especially pleased to be co-presenting with Tony. Dr. D'Amato has been a fantastic partner and helper over a extended period now. I'm very grateful, and it's always fun to engage with Tony. He did a great job teeing things up here, more than teeing things up, really setting things up, particularly from an ecological, scientific, data-driven standpoint. As Tony said, from my point, I'll pivot here to just kind of drill in a little bit and really just share some perspectives from one person here, a forester, a policymaker with 25 years in the department that is by statute charged with managing, stewarding, guiding, and supporting the 4.5 million acres of forest land in Vermont. So my hope is to underscore and to complement Tony's piece by sharing some reflections from that policy and cultural realm, from particularly my 12 years as commissioner in that department and Vermont State Forester. My hope is to maybe give a sense of some reflections on the state of our forest lands, changes in conservation and stewardship over particularly the last couple decades, and a look ahead, importantly, to where we may be heading in our what I'll call our relationship with forests, and including elements of sustainability and adaptability. Of course, I'm eager to take your questions and hear your input, and so I'll try to be fairly quick to get through here. Feel like I should give a caveat here, fair warning. I am a passionate, dedicated person when it comes to forests and forestry, and I'm aware that not everybody sees the world as I do. And so as the old car ads, maybe dating myself here, used to say, your mileage may vary. But here's my take on particularly the state of Vermont's forests. When I consider such a question, where are we at? I do so from a standpoint of forest health as a sort of paramount function and sustainability. I'm big on function, ecological function, that is things like nutrient cycling, hydrologic regulation, pollination, to name but a few, right? But I like to say that in this way, the word forest, and this is kind of an underlying premise for me to give a sense of where I'm coming from. The word forest is better thought of as a verb than a noun, because of all that forests do. And this is, that function that forests really are active, they're dynamic, they're varied, and they're functional. And it's only compounded when we consider all they do for us. They are functional, and they play this outsized role, as Tony set up very nicely, for us, the people. So I think that should help us remind us that we're part of the forest community, and that we make daily massive demands on what forests do by our presence on the planet and our massive footprint. And so that in turn underscores my personal definition of forestry, which is the peaceful and productive coexistence of forests and people. So accordingly, my little overview of the current status and trends is organized kind of around the old three-legged stool of sustainability, and I'll add in adaptability. That really it's three components. That's ecological, cultural, and economic. In the real world, and that's the world I purport to be reporting from here, none of these is worth anything without the others. Without economic or cultural sustainability, ecological sustainability really doesn't matter. So we need all three, and that's how I kind of break it down. So here we go. I'll start with the good news. The big news, Vermont, I like to say, is forest strong. You remember when Tropical Storm Irene blew through, and out of that emerged this idea of we're Vermont strong. What a great thing. And at the time I thought, yeah, and we're strong in part because of the resilience that our forested landscape confers. Community resilience, ecologic resilience, flood resilience, economic resilience, I'd like to think. So to me, it's really powerful to think of Vermont's strength that is being engendered largely by our landscape of forests and farms. So I like to think we are Vermont strong. So as Tony covered, heavily forested, 3/4 of the state. And broadly speaking, our forests are in remarkably good shape, really. Largely intact, remarkably resilient, and growing. Our growth to removals ratio is still well above 2-to-1. For example, and that's a very good thing, because although largely overlooked and unheralded, as Tony has hinted at, forests have colossal importance in our lives, with massive public benefits accruing from largely private forest lands. We're 75% forested, about 85% of that is privately owned, and that's mostly non-industrial private forest lands. You all know the list, right? Forests provide clean air and pollution protection, clean water, water supply, flood resilience, carbon storage, sequestration, landscape and community resilience, habitat, biodiversity, connectivity, human health, community vitality, quality of life. They provide the natural infrastructure and the scenic backdrop for a world-class outdoor recreation and tourism economies. Forests are inherently linked with agricultural lands and agricultural ownerships. That's an impressive and a very important list, by the way, conferring great strength to our state. And I haven't even mentioned the nearly $2 billion in annual economic activity that accrues in our state from this forest land based, largely privately held. So ecologically, culturally, and economically, our forests really do deliver, and they deliver in the most cost-effective way possible. The alternatives for clean water, for air quality mitigation, are very costly and expensive. We're lucky to have this. And so we have this strong incentive to maintain our forest strength, as I call it, through conservation of healthy, intact, and functioning forest systems. And again, they're generally doing well, but there are several unsettling trends, and that's where our story here gets decidedly less good newsy. Tony can do this much better and has covered some of this, but ecologically, again, to take three legs of the stool, we have increasing occurrence and negative impacts from invasive plants, pests, and pathogens. Increased dieback and mortality in some tree species, decreased growth in some species, increasing regeneration failures exacerbated by overbrowsing and/or invasives, climate change alterations and disruptions to ecosystem processes at a rate that outstrips forest's natural, impressive ability to adjust, and with a cascade of far-reaching ill effects, changes in phenology, timing of bud break and flowering, out of synchrony with sort of partner organizations, hydrologic wackiness, altered species interactions, and then this radiating, degrading effects from poorly implemented development of built infrastructure. So all of these are having this sort of growing, increasing ecological threat to our forest health and productivity. Culturally, though, here and economically is where it really falls off a cliff, in my view, particularly over the last several years. Whereas the pandemic should have put a light on the importance of forests and the role of good forestry in keeping forests forest. What the pandemic showed us is, yes, outdoors are very important. This historic spike in outdoor recreation, visitation to natural areas, our dependence on them. That's good, and it brought pressures. At the same time, the COVID pandemic shone a light on the vulnerabilities we have in our global marketplace and the role of how forests are in a global marketplace and are vulnerable to the whims and changes, and how vulnerable we are. I'd like to think that at the same time, climate change and the growing perception of the threats of climate and biodiversity crises that they are saying forests are important. And this should be the time, in my view, where the world has said, you know what? Wow, look at this importance of forests for human health and togetherness, for economic development, for ecological function. And boy, those forestry people were right all along, weren't they? And instead, I feel like it's just kind of gone the other way. And instead, we have this increasing awareness gap about our astounding dependence on and our consumption of forest products that Tony hinted at, especially wood products. A narrow, shallow, incomplete understanding of and reaction to climate change. What I'm saying here is, hey, trees are important. That's lesson one from climate change. Great, good news. Unfortunately, it's turned into, well, then why would you ever cut a tree? And especially, why would you ever burn one? And so that's that shallow, narrow view that sort of is an emotional response that's convenient and easy, but it's also really problematic. So we have a lawsuit of an advocacy group suing the state for claiming unlawful management of the state lands. Pleased to inform you that just a week ago, the Superior Court dismissed that case as having no merit. But it's a real signal of where we're at when we should be kind of rebounding and saying, boy, we have a chance to get it right and hold it all together and adapt for the future. This is a really troublesome sort of reaction. So we're basically losing our social license for forestry practice. We have an aging ownership of landowners, a lack of estate planning for continuing forest ownership, other demographic changes. We are therefore seeing decreasing parcel size and increasing numbers of parcels, increasing fragmentation. Tony mentioned that forest loss, the first time in 100 years documented forest loss, whereas for a century we had an degrading forest situation. Now it's going the other way. And here's the trick, is that rather than having us say, boy, what does that mean? What are the drivers of that forest loss? It's being portrayed and being interpreted as forest loss is logging. Logging is the threat to forest, and that's not the case. We're talking about conversion to non-forest through development, to some extent agricultural conversion. I'm not here to complain about that, but I am here to complain that we need a more focused view here and to understand that we can't just simply react and say, well, we're losing forests, that's bad, and therefore let's shut down that which kept the forest in the condition that it's in and has held together an economic model of private ownership of forest lands. So that's challenging, and we really need to dig into that. Forest loss is not attributable to logging. In most contexts and forms, logging is a tool for conservation and stewardship of forests, not a driver of forest loss. So the last piece then would be the economic sustainability. Where do we stand with private ownership of forest land and its potential going forward? The status is really great economically if you're selling forest land for development. I mean, I think you're probably aware real estate values have skyrocketed, transactions are peaking, and so, but it's not at all great if you want to buy, own, hold, steward, or manage forest lands. All of those costs are going up. There's a raging storm in the forest economy that includes losses of sawmills and pulp mills in our region, a workforce crisis, skyrocketing costs of fuel, energy, equipment, human resources. Increased globalization of the marketplace leads to higher costs, low prices, and less control over the costs of production. We are seeing some good news in this sort of slow movement towards payment for ecosystem services. Carbon's getting a lot of attention. Perhaps water and water supply could be not far behind. That's helpful. I'd say it's about time. But we're not seeing any commensurate increase in the value of wood products to the landowner or the logger, even while costs and prices to the end users have increased dramatically. So is there any good news out of all this? I would like to quickly get to yes. I do think we've seen an increased awareness of the importance of forests. That's got to be good in all they do for us. And I think to some extent, a lesser extent, but to some extent, the role of good forestry in keeping forests forests. But, you know, something, as I said, is not quite closing this fully, this loop, and getting us where we all need to be in partnership. I will tell a quick story here as an aside that Tony mentioned something that triggered this. So, you know, lots of good love for you know, agriculture struggles in many ways, but certainly in food systems and local food systems, a lot of love, right? And so it's easy to go downtown in Burlington, go to a restaurant where the local food suppliers are celebrated on the menu, right? And I celebrate that. That's fantastic. I was in one very famous establishment in Burlington that features wood-fired food, lots of wood featured in the facility. I asked my server, I see where the tomatoes came from, I see where the cheese comes from. I wonder, where does the firewood come from? And they were dumbstruck. Nobody knew, nobody was prepared to tell me, even while they're celebrating all of the good local food. They're cooking it with wood, they're making a big deal about that, but they're missing that opportunity. Well, finally, it was an actual owner that got sent out and said, what a great question. It comes from Clifford's Lumber in Heinsberg. And I was like, beautiful. That's family farm and forest owners supplying it. Why don't you celebrate that as well? And I just share that with you as a symptom of what we're working against here. Is it's just right there for the taking. It just does not rise to the same level. And I think that's problematic. especially when you consider, boy, we've come a long way, folks, particularly in forestry and silviculture, a century-long evolution and advancement in silviculture from its origins in a kind of a production, extraction mentality, plantation mentality, to a modern ecological mentality, including climate smart, adaptive, restorative practices. An initiative, a movement that's really, that we should all be very proud of Tony and colleagues really leading that way and showing a way towards ecological silviculture, and seeing policy shifts in favor that look to support the development of old forests and broaden our approach and current use to what we value and what is important. And so there are these kind of recent examples, the Foresters for the Birds collaboration of Audubon, Vermont, and Vermont Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation to kind of seize this continent of common ground. If you're interested in songbirds and their habitat, and if you're interested in wood products, there's an overlap. There's a commonality here, and partnerships that plow that ground are the most powerful. There's an emerging marketplace that may pay landowners for ecosystem services, innovations in forest products. These are additional positive changes that I find as promising possibilities. And from my time seeing the last 12 years people fracture over all of this, my call here is I just share these as an example of the hope and progress that's possible when genuine partnerships succeed in capitalizing on this continent of common ground shared by forest lovers of all stripes. So I'll leave you with this thought. Imagine we could contribute meaningfully to the construction and heating of housing for humans, particularly affordable housing with locally sourced, climate-smart wood from silvicultural operations that enhance and maintain habitat and protect water quality and store carbon and sequester carbon, all while keeping forests forested for the long term and maintaining a continuous flow of those many benefits they provide. And continue to provide this seriously long list of goods and services that we rely on. So, you know, I'm thinking about this, driving back from a meeting this morning, late summer leading us into another glorious fall here. I'm reminded once again just how beautiful our state is, how naturally beautiful. But we'd do well, I think, to remember that it is not wilderness and it's not accidental. It is brought to us by generations of working landscape families of owners of farms and forests, and the people who worked the land, and certainly by the family and individual owners that kept and cared for this land for generations. So remember, when we make things, when we grow, make, and sell things like world-class cheese or globally prized hardwood furniture, for example, we make Vermont. We have been for generations now. We make Vermont, Vermont. We make the best of Vermont, and investing in and strengthening our land-based culture and economy is our best hope for maintaining an ecologically intact and functioning landscape. And to me, that's what I'd say from my perch is the cultural gap is our biggest. We have partners say there at UVM, a powerhouse of information and rigor. We have practitioners all over the state that have embraced this, and yet we have a growing chasm of the people that are just moving in a whole different direction. We have a chance to get this right. We have a chance to keep this forested state forested. There's never been a time in the history of people when people weren't completely, utterly dependent on trees and forests, shelter, tools, heat, etc. And there's no reason to think that is going to change. And yet we do not have the cultural, the economic, or the policy frameworks in place to support that which brought us this, a culture of forestry on our land. And I really think it's time for us to turn and face and sort of avoid the noise and get down to the signal of we're in this together, we have a chance to get it right, fortunately. And so I'll pause there and hope we can get to some good conversation. Thank you.
Mike, thank you so much, both of you, Tony and Mike, the fabulous presentations and inspiring for me in particular. Maybe all of you, I hope. And yeah, let's open it up to questions. We do have a number of questions in the chat, so maybe both of the presenters, you can have a look at some of those, and we can also entertain any on the fly as well. Let's see. Could just go through them, but do we see any we could group together? Maybe, current use is something that is mentioned a couple times here in the private, like that big, broad, privately owned sector of forest, sort of commenting on the current programs, I guess, and how effective they are, and then, more
Sure.
broadly.
Well, I'll jump at that one quickly, just to say that current use, the use value appraisal program, that for those who might not know quickly, it's a tax benefit program, policy of the state to reduce property taxes for qualifying farm or forest landowners who keep their land from being developed and keep it in active farm or forestry use. It is widely considered, it's not just me, I've heard many say it, the most effective, important conservation program in our state's history. There's 2 million acres of forest land enrolled. More than half of the eligible forest land is enrolled in current use. And landowner after landowner will line up to say, I could not keep my forest land intact if I had to pay development value property tax, ad valorem tax for my land that overlooks Mount Mansfield or something, because its building development potential is so high. So it's extremely important. It's worked pretty well for a long time. And over the last few years, I'm very proud to have led kind of a historic changes. Basically, they are to allow ecologically significant treatment areas to be included in the program with a diminished importance on the repeated production of forest products. So emphasizing that some places are ecologically significant, a little bit more sensitive than others. So we built that program, lifted the cap on it. That was several years ago. And then this 2 years, the session before last, we created a new reserve forest land category that is intended to allow for management towards old forest characteristics. Certainly old forest, we just have so little of it. That being the most, the best expression of a forest. The point we made was that there are new restorative silvicultural practices. There's ways to jumpstart a stagnant forest stand it can't make it any older, but it can enhance the acceleration of old forest attributes. And so we built this sort of kit of practices, and now there's, for qualifying parcels, you can be in current use with a goal of growing and maintaining old forests and not having the mandate of repeated forest crops. That's significant and dangerous in my view. It's another story, but also very good, and I was proud to have led it, and I think it's a really important signal that, the world has changed. When current use was written, there was no climate change. There weren't a lot of these threats. We need to consider those, and so I think current use, the short answer here is, the summary is current use is incredibly important, has been, and it's being managed carefully of late to adapt and adjust and change with the changing world. I hope that helps whoever asked the question about current use. It's wildly important. It's also got a big target on its back because it's foregone revenue, tax revenues that pay for our schooling, education fund and municipal rates. So, $65 million every year that the legislature says, boy, is it worth it? I sat in the Ways and Means Committee for 12 years saying, fair enough, Madam Chair, to look at the costs of the current use program, but also fair to therefore to pay attention to the benefits, and they are massive, right? $35 million in annual stumpage payments to landowners for managing their lands, the taxes they pay on that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's important, but it is misunderstood, and it is often a target for cuts, and that would be a big mistake. Thanks for the chance to go off on current use.
Excellent. A lot of love in local agriculture, as local food, as you had mentioned, Mike. And I'm looking at Juan's question. I don't know, Juan, if you want to, if maybe you can share some of the love from agro into forestry, and do consider that. So I don't know, Juan, if you want to, or that question. But if all of you are seeing that question there, do you consider that the practices under agroforestry can contribute to forest protection, structure, process, functions, and maybe cultural stuff?
Go for it, Tony.
Yeah, I mean, I think it softens the matrix for the species that rely on forests, because you're taking maybe that hard transition from a, vertically stratified complex ecosystem that, isn't managed on an annual basis. And, that an organism might move into an agricultural field where that might be bit structured. So having agroforestry is kind of a growing part of like the agricultural footprint, without it reducing the closed canopy, like intact forest land we have, I think is a good thing. But I think and to be honest, I would argue it's also taking like what we all recognize is that trees are incredible for carbon and for other ecosystem service providing, and we're kind of adding some of that incredible ecosystem structure and components into an agricultural system that often provides a lot of benefits, but some of the challenges in terms of like above ground carbon storage and certainly water filtration, et cetera, might not be as great as you'd find in a forested setting. And so I'm excited about agroforestry in terms of, again, kind of softening the matrix around forest land. It also can be places, if those trees are being thought of as being grown for forest products, it might be an easier entry point for some people to recognize, because again, I think just psychologically people view agricultural fields as a managed landscape, and then once they step into the forest that was an agricultural field 80 years ago, they view that as like a wild, pristine place that should never be managed. So I think it could be another place to think through kind of local wood production and other kind of non-timber forest products production. But I guess I'm hesitant to say we would want to expand agroforestry at the expense of current forest land, but instead maybe soften the agricultural matrix around forest land with agroforestry for the species that might benefit from trees within fields, and then also obviously the ecosystem services that would benefit from adding trees to a field.
Juan's mic and video aren't working, so he's unable to comment. I thank you for that response, and I am also eyeing that parenthetical in his comment, especially to agroforestry techniques that are non-invasive to forests, and I know a little bit about those, but that's maybe another angle as well, as opposed to planting in ag fields, but also growing different crops within forest systems that are more complementary.
Yep, no, I definitely see there's potential there. Again, just recognizing, we want to make sure we're sustaining understory species and other, making sure that that we're doing that in a way that sustains the other functions of the forest. Once you start having kind of repeated entries or into those areas, there can be impact even there too. That maybe doesn't seem intrusive, but we limit our trafficking to. It looks pretty heavy impact, but it's to trails and to other, so trying to make sure that we're, even if there's a lot of foot traffic, that can have impact on the forest and its ecological integrity. So we want to make sure we're good about that.
Great, thank you. We have about 5 more minutes, and I'll encourage anyone to raise their hand as well. I'm just sort of scanning this list here. Presenters, feel free to jump in and interrupt me if you want to jump on something.
Susan is signaling her intent.
Yes.
Yes, yeah.
Hi, Susan. How are you?
Thanks. Good. I was really interested in, I think it was Tony's slide about the trade-offs, and I want to make sure I interpret it correctly. So you can have a forest, increasing carbon storage, but then for diversity and functionality, you may want to have gaps to increase light. So I was interested in the time period, and that maybe we talked about trade-offs over a longer time period, there would be less of them. Like, I wanted to make sure I understood what the trade-offs were, because of course with trade-offs, you feel like some people winning, that might not lead to this or increase this cultural gap, which was a really interesting point of Mike's. Like, so it's really the time element and the trade-off. It was a graph.
Yeah, and I think also just forests are, as we all appreciate, for a long time been viewed as a multifunctional systems that we want to derive many benefits from, and part of that was driven by really in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, a singular focus on maximizing volume. Like it was like one objective was like most important, and it really kind of, I think, blew up in our faces when we recognized we were compromising a lot of other objectives. And so forestry is kind of maybe relative to kind of the more recent push for multifunctional agriculture, really kind of going in that direction for a long time. And what's been interesting is with carbon coming on the scene, all of a sudden we like reverted. That's the objective, like maximizing carbon in the woods above all else. And I'm all for carbon. I'm all for old forests. I'm all for not cutting trees. I mean, if you look into what we do, like we talk a lot about that. but not every place that maximizes carbon is also great for every wildlife species we have, or certainly for some of the other values. And in particular, when we look at even the species that dominate those areas that are maximum carbon, they might not actually be as well adapted as some other species to climate change. And so oftentimes species that we think of like red oak, classic species people talk about as being the future of our forest, because it's very warm and dry weather adapted. It doesn't regenerate like in an intact closed canopy stand. It needs an opening to regenerate. And so you're going to have to like knock some of that carbon down and to actually get it out there. And so it's I think the conundrum we're facing, it is that gap that Mike mentioned. Many want to maximize one thing at this point from our forest. They'll say they're interested in other things, but generally it's just maximizing, not cutting. I think is really what I feel like it is from some groups in their backyard. Of course, they're still using wood, so they're maximizing cutting elsewhere. But I think that's the trade-off piece that we're talking about, and probably the biggest like stark contrast on that is with some of the shrubland and kind of early successional wildlife species that they do need, occasionally this mosaic of younger forests being created. And so those are going to be reductions in carbon. Temporarily, to your point, they're it's going to take a while for them to grow back to where they are. But I think in the time frame that we work in, people are going to be pretty obstructionist to that practice, given the instant carbon impact of it. So we're trying to be more holistic, or I guess we always have been, but trying to remind people that we're trying to like really factor in. It's not just a single objective or a single outcome, and that there isn't a silver bullet, which is I think why we enjoy doing what we do. But it also creates a challenge when we're trying to really sustain all of these amazing things in this exact same spot. You just can't do it. You have to think through like this broader landscape, and Vermont conservation design. Many of these different plans for the regions really acknowledge that, but we're I think increasingly facing, just to Mike's point, the idea that we shouldn't cut a tree in Vermont, just because of carbon. And that's tricky. Again, I think it's also kind of globally selfish, right? If we're going to keep using wood.
Just to maybe, yeah.
Can I ask a related question? So how can UVM extension help out with what Mike called the cultural gap, the growing chasm with people acknowledging? Because I thought that was a really important point about the forest loss is not due to cutting. The pesting basis, everything else. So like, what can we do to improve that if that's going in the wrong direction?
I'll just say that's related to Leslie's question as well, I think, with the legislature and messaging. So yeah, maybe we can kind of close with sort of hitting that.
You want to jump in there, Tony?
Yeah, go ahead, Mike. Or do you want to go? Or we can maybe both say our piece on it. So go ahead, Mike.
Okay. The legislative piece there, it's an interesting question, because I think the legislature hears often, they certainly did for me when I had the role, about the importance of forests, the threats to forests, and to their credit, they asked a lot of questions. They hear reports of forest loss, and they want to know from the commissioner what's going on and what are we doing about it. And it was frustrating, to be honest with you, because there's this very shallow level of understanding and then a quick reaction. They want so biology, even economy, it's messy, right? Policy seeks black and white, one size fits all answers. And this is my greatest challenge as a policymaker, was that knowing, as an ecologist, as a forester, it's not how it works out there. So they want really simple solutions to really massive, complex problems. And I think, so bless their hearts, they're interested, they want to help, but they don't have time to really dig in, and they don't want to hear the whole story, which is culture, economy. So there's a great question in here about some massive, impactful forest research project. You have them. Tony's got some great adaptive silviculture stuff going on right now. There's great research coming out of UVM. Unfortunately, what we need is, where's the research? How do we understand? It's sort of a social dimension of all of this, and then markets and innovation and engineering and materials testing. We have the wood. There's a need. We have the wood, and we have the expertise to get it out of the woods and make it into things in a responsible, intelligent, local way. And it isn't happening because there's no legal, institutional, or economic framework in place that values it. And that's the problem. So, and that's sort of embodied by the legislature, is just, we have to deal with climate change. We have to deal with the biodiversity crisis. They don't want to hear about truck weights on interstates as being a barrier to kind of local commerce. to the cost of production for labor and workers' compensation and energy costs. And that's what we got to get to. There's a lot of talk, and in my view, it's too superficial and doesn't get at root causes. Root causes. Land use decisions are made at the kitchen table, not at the planning room. And unfortunately, that's where all the, at the town, at the permitting, when you get to that point, it's already too late. We need to talk to people about their land and the fate and future of their land and the different options for land ownership and stewardship. And we need, instead of just a quick one size fits all, let's regulate it. I hope that makes sense. I realize it's short on time and I want to give Tony a chance. So I did what I do, which is babble. I hope it made sense.
Thanks, Mike. That's great. And we are out of time. But yeah, Tony, why don't you just get in a last word here,
Great.
and some people have hopped off already, and we'll say goodbye. And
Yeah, and the last thing I'll say is the microcosm of the issue is that if we take the UVM's comprehensive sustainability plan, there was no mention of like what they're going to build anything out of on this campus. And then more broadly, if we look at the biggest challenges facing our region, it's, lack of affordable housing, lack of housing, declining job markets in rural centers that historically have been forest dependent communities. And so there's so many of these linkages between what we care about as it relates to society and as it relates to the globe that really point to, gosh, doesn't it seem to make sense to be doing a little bit more local forestry that is connecting these climate smart materials to things like the inequities of affordable housing, and certainly, the next campus building that really is kind of saying, hey, like we get it, like it's all there, like whether we're UVM or a local community, that we understand that like local wood is going to provide jobs in the woods, it's going to provide jobs, it's going to provide affordable housing, all these different connections. So I think beyond like just arguing we don't want to lose forests because they're awesome, I think we need to also just keep tying it back to there are just some broader societal issues that forests are a huge solution to, and we it's amazingly frustrating how blind that is, on this campus. And I think more broadly with communities that say they're super environmental, but they just don't, they don't want to kind of go there with the local wood production. So I think that's a piece we need to also be pushing on a bit and thinking through.
great. That's great.